my topic in particular, which is demand-side ecosystem services, which has been what I believe to be a shortcoming in many of the ecosystem service studies. So I'm pretty sure that most of the members of the audience here are real familiar with what ecosystem services are. If not, they're all the things that nature does for people. Generally, people don't have to pay for those things, although there's been a lot of different innovations that are creating market-based mechanisms now so that they can incentivize ecosystem service provision. They can be provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and those are all the things that people directly use and encounter and benefit from. There's also the ecological processes that provide supporting services. So those are the things that are indirectly benefiting people over time. Sanjay yesterday at dinner made the point, and I think it's a really relevant one, that we don't often consider when we're talking about ecosystem services. Everyone tends to get real excited about them and talks about how can we get more, what can we do to make sure that we're conserving ecosystem service provision. But we don't necessarily talk a lot about what our desired future looks like with respect to ecosystem services. And I think that that leads us to a lot of problems. And that's going to be something that I talk about here. Obviously, every story needs a protagonist. And Dave, yesterday, with all of his wisdom, was explaining to me that I needed to find one consistent example that I could follow all the way through my presentation. And I think he had deer in the forest in mind, but I found a better one. Do you like this one? Yeah. So he's happy about this. This is Dave imagining his desired future condition. This is from a hike earlier in the week. Dave's from California, and so he is using the cultural service of recreation to improve himself through recreation. However, he's also discovered that there's other ways to use this stock of natural capital in such that he can provide a cooling service to his beverage. And this is great for him. He is maximizing his utility and very happy about this discovery. There's a lot of trade-offs with all these different ecosystem services. You can use one forest for multiple uses: timber, collecting mushrooms, sequestering carbon, and so on. Sometimes that causes conflicts. In Dave's case, not so much. And so what I said earlier about all of the different ways in which we create market solutions to some ecosystem services problems. Some because in the case of the glacier is a pure public good. And by that I mean it's non-rival. If Dave is enjoying the glacier, it doesn't mean that he's stopping somebody else from enjoying the glacier. As opposed to the example of a pure market good, like if Dave eats a piece of pizza, I can't eat that piece of pizza. Less for me. The other element that describes the characteristics of market and non-market goods is whether or not they're excludable. So you can either put up a fence and you can stop people from enjoying the glacier, maybe not so much. And so in this case, the glacier is a pure public good. There's not a lot of revenue happening as Dave is visiting and enjoying the glacier. And so the case about market-based mechanisms has to do with taking these characteristics, those elements that were in the red box, and trying to figure out ways in which you might assign attributes so that you can move them over to the blue box, the market-based goods. And they might be carbon trading, wetland mitigation, banking, water payments, but also taxes and incentives. Many of these are what are termed payment for ecosystem services. Dave has very cleverly decided that in California, glaciers are a very rare commodity. And so he has decided that he is going to market the cooling services of the pieces of glacier, thereby taking it from being a pure public good and turning it into a marketable solution. He fills up his rucksack full of glacier pieces to bring back to California with him. He's already done an assessment. There's a very high willingness to pay in California for glacier. They're very rare, and as far as he knows, they're disappearing down there. So he's prospecting, and he's about to deliver an awful lot of glacier to California, maybe world record amount, and he's anticipating a profit. However, what he doesn't anticipate that this is a really heavy backpack, and that hike back to the trailhead is much larger than he anticipated. Isn't that right, Dave? Yeah. And so that furrow on his forehead that you can see in the picture is actual statistical psychological evidence of declining marginal utility. The furrowed brow is one of those things that happens for many of the people that attempt to enter a market for ecosystem services if they haven't thought through all of the elements of both supply. There's a whole lot of glacier out there, but then there's also factors complicating the marketability and ultimately a demand. And so there we get to a feedback loop element, and it complicates all sorts of things for ecosystem services and makes those that work with ecosystem services either really challenged or really frustrated. So if we can imagine, if you're increasing supply, say you want to incentivize provision of ecosystem services, you're turning the faucet on. You can do things like you might, there's logging for water. There's replanting for water. You might reforest a riparian watershed in order to cool water before it gets to an urban area. You might plant new trees that sequester more carbon. All of these things are actions that people can take. They can be incentivized and they can provide more ecosystem services than before. Frequently, we talk about a desired level and wanting to always continue to provide more and more ecosystem services. What we don't think about is the fact that we are increasingly, as a society, using more ecosystem services per capita on an annual basis. So we're not thinking about the leakage to the system. In Dave's case, he's not thinking about the leakage of the glacier down his back as he's heating up on his hike getting back to the trailhead. He's also not thinking about all the losses that he might incur of his glacier as he's flying back to California, or the fact that his airplane is emitting carbon on each way back and forth to the glacier. These are all complications to the plan, and they're not being accounted for. This is also the case with a lot of the ways in which we're dealing with ecosystem services, which leads us to the new concept of one planet forestry. One planet forestry is accounting for all of these things, not just at a local level, but also at a global level. So that means that when we think about forestry, we're not just thinking about managing the trees, managing the soil, managing the wildlife. We're also thinking about our operations, how much energy we're spending as we're traveling back and forth to places, how many emissions our fleet is generating as we're driving back and forth to trailheads. And so it's a much more comprehensive approach to the way in which we might think about forestry. It's a new one, and it's not always accepted because it's not the way we've traditionally done business or had to do business. That's no longer the case because if we're managing for nature's interest, if we think about ecosystem services as a flow of benefits that's coming from a stock of natural capital, and what I mean by that is the whole planet is covered with this living crust that is generating through net primary productivity all sorts of living benefits for us. Just like as if you were to go to a financial advisor and you said, how do I become independently wealthy? Your financial advisor, she might say, well, you take your capital accounts and you live within the bounds of your interest. If you begin to cut into your capital stocks, over time you're going to have less interest generated and you will have more financial vulnerability. You might have to work harder to maintain place. Ecosystem service studies, even amongst professionals, do not differentiate frequently between what is a stock of natural capital and what is a flow of ecosystem services. The problem with this is that it leads us to illusions about the actions that we're taking and the integrity of our natural systems. Just because water is flowing down a river doesn't mean that we've got a really great system about ecosystem services, because it might be meaningful what's happening on the upstream. That's one point. A second point is the ecological footprint, or the demand for ecosystem services. All the things that we do that use up different kinds of this natural capital, or the ecosystem services that flow from them. Things like trees that sequester the carbon that we emit each year. The number of hectares of forest it takes to generate the drinking water that we drink or use in bathing or washing or just general industrial processes to produce the things that we consume each year. the cropland that it takes to grow all of the food we eat each year, and so on. So if you compare the ecosystem services to the ecological debt over time, what we find is that in the United States in particular, that red line is the ecological footprint, and the green line is biocapacity, or the natural capital systems that we have within the United States. And we went into overshoot just shortly after 1965, which means we're dipping into our stocks of natural capital as a public. We are incurring an ecological debt for future generations. This means if we compare nature's interests to our footprint, at a global perspective, this is a map from 1961, and I was so thrilled to learn that Brad actually made this map several years ago when he worked with the Global Footprint Network. Red is debt, green is credit, and this is 2005. More and more countries are going into the red, and to contradict some of the statements that were made in some of the earlier plenaries, it's an important point to note that as countries get wealthier, it's not necessarily the case that they're going to be reducing their ecological footprint over time. And in fact, statistically speaking, it's exactly the opposite. Here we show land area, and this map is distorted. So each country here is a different color. Keep your eyes on the color. Here is timber imports. So this is for the whole country. Purple over there is Japan, surprisingly. And this is forest losses. So wealthier countries over time are also getting better and better as they conserve land cover internally to their nation's borders. They're also getting better at exporting their ecological debt to other countries. There's an equity issue there, and it also lends a lot of complexity to our systems, because if we're managing public goods at a global level, what happens when we lose coastal rainforests in other parts of the planet will ultimately come back to us. There are many studies showing that deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon currently is impacting the amount of rainfall in Texas, for example. So what happens to us? I think someone yesterday said, we're all connected, we're all one. And to manage ecosystem services locally means you also have to manage them globally. Because culture will eat strategy for breakfast. We have a culture of consuming ecosystem services, and even if we strategize on providing more and more, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to hit our bottom line, and in fact, often the opposite. Within the Forest Service, we're doing a number of different studies comparing supply and demand, and the other presenters in this session are going to point out a couple of very important attributes of this. This is one study that I'm working on with Dave Nichols out of Sitka. On one side is the supply of carbon sequestration. You should be in the other room if you're really interested in this, because Dave Demore is wonderful. On the other side is demand. All of the different communities are emitting carbon through their way of life, through their activity, the transport of goods that we get up here. And even though it was said a few days ago, or on our first opening plenary, that Alaskans have a very low ecological footprint, I don't know how many of you get a community-supported agriculture box here in Juneau, you know, the boxes, and have them flown in from Washington State in order to enjoy the locally grown organic produce. So it's one of those things that we need to look analytically at the claims of, are we really, do we really have a low ecological footprint? And how does that compare to the ability of the natural systems around us to provide in perpetuity the ecosystem services that we need? Doesn't mean necessarily that we have to do everything. There's a lot of comparative advantage to be had here, but the fact that we're not approaching it from an analytical point means that we're debilitated when we think about solutions in the long run. So it means that One Planet Forestry must address not only what we are producing from the forests, but also what we're consuming, how we're selling, investing, and planning for those. So again, going back to desired future condition, I'm going to go to a couple of examples here from the Tongass, because this is Juneau after the avalanche that took out the power production. This is that's the photo on the right. the power production here in Juneau is hydropower. And after that, there were the graph on the left here. This is Wayne Lady's study that was recently published on the fact that Juneauites, that dark bar on the left, produced more energy savings, voluntary energy savings, quicker than almost any case study in the world that's been documented. And then this graph shows how long those changes lasted. The dark bars are the changes that were implemented, and the white bars are the changes that reverted. The point of this is that we can change the way in which we are consuming ecosystem services. And the Forest Service is looking at different ways in which they are costing us. The Tongass in particular, many of you probably are not aware that the Tongass completed a footprint study for all of its operations in 2008. It's publishable, it's published and available on the web. Those numbers are very valuable in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, estimated electricity use and water use, and it also follows with data and cost to public infrastructure and helps us look at the ways in which we are using ecosystem services relative to those that we're attempting to manage. Just like it doesn't make sense for Dave to run up to the glacier with his backpack to collect glacier, it probably doesn't make us a lot of sense to run around with helicopters doing helicopter logging if we're attempting to sequester more carbon with that activity. The point being that there's always a place for different kinds of land management, but that we must do the cost calculations in a predetermined and intentional way so that we know the units over time, we can benchmark them, and we can reduce public costs, not just in dollar terms, but also in the way in which they're impacting ecosystem services and the ecological debt that we're passing to future generations. There's many, many things to be discussed with this. I've introduced a lot of very complicated topics, but the beauty of this is that we have a whole group of experts then that are going to crack open this nut a bit. Speaking of which, the first nut on order is Colin Beier. And so the way we're going to do it is each speaker is going to have one question. So if there's anyone that has a question for me, you can go to the microphone. Colin's going to swap out his computer, and then everyone's going to come up here on the panel, and there will be an opportunity for you to address the panel as a whole.
Get a round of applause for Trista.
Thank you.
Just a moment here.
No questions with all that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Has anyone thought about taking change in behavior as a result of the power in Juneau and extrapolating that to get a sense of how much we could save with consumers and what were the limitations on being able to behave that way for a longer period of time?
Yes, and so the numbers are globally speaking, just within the corporate sector, with energy alone, $2 trillion, and within the government sector, we're estimating between 20 to 40% on all energy costs. And the quickest changes are those that don't require technological fixes or very large or expensive changes to infrastructure, particularly behavioral change. There's one change that we're looking at right now with sustainable operations that we think is going to return our highest return on investment, $1 million. And we think that it's not going to cost more than probably $2,000 worth of equipment, agency-wide. And that is something that can be implemented on existing protocol, and it is increasing tire inflation pressure across the fleet. That increasing tire pressure or adding that to a safety check will increase our entire fleet just 1 mile per gallon. 1 mile per gallon averaged across our whole Forest Service fleet equals $1 million. So the kinds of fixes that we have, we might think about more ways to sequester carbon. when we are thinking about offsetting our emissions. But we also might think about ways to reduce those emissions, and many of those can be much more cost effective in order to make things balance out. So I'm going to hand it back over to Colin. Colin is, we've been working together ever since my first year in Juneau here, which is wonderful. Both of us live in other places now. Colin is at SUNY University, formerly a PhD student of Terry Chapin's up at University of Alaska Fairbanks, and he's going to present on landscape assessment and particularly tease out some of those elements of supply and demand that I talked about earlier.
Thanks, Trista, and thank you everybody for being here. It's a pleasure. It's been almost 5 years since I left, and I'm not sure why I left, but I think it's because I got a job. But what I'd like to talk about today is really Trista's blazed the trail on a lot of this. I want to kind of bring us down to Southeast and think about how these ideas can be implemented using the information that we have and with some methods that reflect practical realities in terms of what we can do, and as well as also reflect some of these ideas that Trista's mentioned that we need to think about, both the human and the ecological components of ecosystem services. As Trista mentioned, a service is really any ecosystem function that benefits humans, and we often, and much of the literature is guilty of ignoring the second part in order to get the idea across. We're sometimes forgetting what's the real human benefit, and really what a service is it's something that emerges from the interaction of people and nature. And so as this shows, and Terry put up a similar figure to this, and we've had various iterations of this over time, and a lot of this is influenced by a lot of the frameworks that Terry's put up, but just this idea of people and nature are one system. And so we think about the ecological subsystem, the human subsystem, and one of the ways that they're very closely coupled is through ecosystem services, and then the feedback loop is the impacts that we have. These are both intentional and unintentional, as Trista was indicating. And when we do an assessment of ecosystem services, we need to understand both sides of the equation. We need to understand the provision of the service. This is a measure of the capacity of the ecosystem to not only generate but regenerate the services. This is a measure of the stock, in a sense, okay, the capital. And then the interest from that is the service, and then there's a measure of the actual use of the service and the flows of benefits to society. And this is not necessarily the same thing as demand, because demand for a service can exceed capacity, but the use of a service can never exceed the amount that's there. So a great example is Katrina, Hurricane Katrina. That system in southern Louisiana was demanding more of a flood regulation service than it could provide. The people there were demanding more of one that could be provided, and so we had a deficit and we had the destruction that occurred there. The idea is that we need to measure services from both sides, and what I want to talk about is just a very simple way to do that. Now, this is necessary, I think, to bring services into resource management. There's a lot of interest in doing this, and there's a lot of questions about how do we assess services, how do we value them, how does this, is this just the latest flavor of the week, or can we actually do something with this? Whether we want to talk about adaptive management, just straight up silviculture, we want to talk about ecosystem-based management, whatever it might be. The reality is, and Trista indicated this, and most of the methods that we have out there don't consider both sides. A lot of the quantification studies that exist indiscriminately use data from either side and just say, here's the service. And the valuation studies tend to really focus on identifying a dollar value, and this is very strictly usually with information on people's willingness to pay or their implicit preferences, such as hedonic pricing and things like that. And the idea here is that we need to get from both sides. Now, there are some existing tools out there like Invest and Aries, which do take into consideration both the provision and the use, both the production and the benefit. And these tools are really, they're emerging and they're really exciting. And in particular, both of them have been designed to be able to be used by a wide variety of audiences. One of the limitations of these tools is that they require a lot of data which you might not have as a manager, And they also, particularly Invest, requires a lot of time in developing models that are specific to your system. And you may not have the time or the energy amongst all the other things as a manager to get involved in that model development. Or the models that you already have might not be suitable. And of course, managers always have to make decisions now, or I should say yesterday, or weeks ago, or months ago, or years ago. So the idea is to have a rapid assessment with existing data and the expert knowledge that's inherent in management, and not solely managers, stakeholders, scientists. A lot of people need to be involved to get a baseline for decision making, and then it allows the incorporation of new ideas and data sets and scenarios. So I just want to give a quick overview of the approach. There's a lot of methodological details that I'm skipping over here that I'd be happy to talk about further. But we need to build an information base or an ontology for our ecosystem services, and we need to gather the data that populates that information base. There's a lot of pre-processing that needs to be done to get all this different information, ecological, social, into one place and be able to compare these things in common units. There's a calculation of watershed ranks and scores, which I could talk about for the whole 20 minutes, but you'd all fall asleep. There's generation of base maps, and then there's the assessment of those base maps. And where most studies have stopped is at the generation of base maps. And what I want to talk about is how going beyond that gives you a lot more information, and how using this approach where you consider both the ecosystem side and the human side, and you come from the outside towards the middle, is going to provide a lot more information. There's a lot of things that we do with the assessment, and I'm going to give some examples of that. So really quickly, this is always a dangerous thing to show in any room, but I'm going to try to do it. This is the kind of the information base, highly simplified, for the assessment of Southeast Alaska that's been done. On the far left column is a type of service. As Trista indicated, there's major types: provisioning, regulating, cultural services. The next column is the indicator of supply. There's an intermediate column, which I'll explain in a minute. It only applies to certain ones. Then there's a use indicator. And then on the far right is the benefit type. So if you follow from the top, old growth forest indicates a provisioning service. The use indicator is second growth forest. We've cut the forest. The benefit type is fiber provision, wood. Okay? Very straightforward, very simple, supply demand. We can also look at a cultural service that's provided by old growth forest, looking at ecotourism clients who are arguably coming to the Tongass, coming to Southeast Alaska to see these amazing medieval, primeval forests that we have here, okay? And that's a recreation benefit. And so we can go through this whole thing. We can look at deer, both the harvest in terms of food provision as well as the recreation benefits from deer. We can look at bear the same way. We can look at murrelet as an indicator of ecological, of intactness and the ecotourism benefits there. Salmon, of course, provisioning and cultural benefits of salmon, and salmon are so critical to this system, it really does an injustice to just give them a couple of lines. But in this case, we're looking at use by both subsistence as well as sport fishing. Obviously, commercial fishing is important. It's not included here because I don't know, we don't have the data for exactly where those fish are coming from in terms of where they're caught and how that relates to specific watersheds that can be attributed to them. There's also the provisioning of marine estuaries and the shellfish harvest areas, which not only have a food benefit, but also the spiritual benefits associated with subsistence lifeway. And of course, I put carbon at the end just because carbon gets so much press. But of course, it is very important, and Dave's going to talk about this, and Dave DeMore talked about it yesterday. But the storage of carbon, and this is a difficult use indicator, because we can look at use in terms of the emissions that we're putting out. We can also think about the global use of this climate regulation service. Everyone benefits from it. There's two other services that I want to talk about, and this is the regulating functions of old growth, riparian forests, and marine estuaries. And you'll notice in the intermediate column there's salmon. And the idea here is that these different ecosystem types help to regulate and maintain the provision of salmon by their connections with the ecology of salmon. And this is just a diagram showing that old growth riparian forest positively influences salmon productivity by regulating stream habitat. There are benefits of salmon productivity both by subsistence harvesters and sport fishing clients, and the types of benefits that those beneficiaries get. We can also look at the importance of marine estuaries in the same way, and I'll follow up with that. So the idea is to build a knowledge base based on what we know, and then trying to use the information that we have to do some assessment. So what this generates after doing a lot of statistics, a lot of analysis of probability distributions, we're basically breaking down these really non-normal probability distributions of these indicators across the landscape into a 4-point ranking system, which is collapsing a lot of variability down. But what it generates are base maps of both provision and use, and I'm just going to put these up, and these are a lot of the indicators we've shown before. And what they're showing here is salmon productivity. You can look at the provision, and you can look at some of the use by different beneficiaries. Same thing with bear habitat. You also have cases where you can look at 2 or more provisions, and the single beneficiary. You can look at marine estuaries and marlet, and you could look at beneficiaries in terms of ecotourism clients. Now, these are the base maps. In the past, these have been used indiscriminately, a provision side or a use side, to represent an ecosystem service, and then there's some analysis done with it. The idea here is to actually do assessment with these data and to intersect them not only across provision and use, but in many different ways. And I want to give you 4 case studies. Really quickly, another thing that needs to be done in management is to prioritize the landscape, and there's probably nowhere that this is more true than in a place like the Tongass. This is just massive. And there has to be the prioritization of adaptive management in the landscape. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, you can't do it everywhere for everything. And so one of the ways to do this is to do some spatial analysis to get a sense of priorities. Now, this should not be the only source of information that you have to make decisions, but it can be helpful. So here's a 250-meter raster that I derived from Wayne Lady's carbon model in a paper he published a few years ago. We can then convert that into watershed ranks. And then one of the things we can do to prioritize is to look at the clustering of this across the landscape. And that's the far right figure here, where we have the high clusters in terms of these are groups of watersheds that are co-located, that are really high in carbon sequestration. And there are low clusters, along the mainland in particular, where they're geographically co-located in low carbon sequestration. And this shouldn't be a huge surprise to anyone who knows this landscape. We're particularly looking at carbon benefits and large contiguous areas of carbon sequestration in our national monument and wilderness areas. And that's taking a raster and doing this. We might also have point data like special use permits and recreation clients, and this is based on data from 2007. And these are the locations as well as the number of people doing different activities. We can then summarize these by the watershed units and then rank them and do the similar kind of clustering so we see where the hot spots and cold spots of this is. And this is just for 07. It's certainly not, I'm not saying these are the only important places. And we all know of cases where these maps might not make local sense. So again, this is where expert knowledge comes in. So 4 very brief case studies with this approach. First, I want to talk about bundling, the idea of bundling of services being related to each other. If you manage for one, you may get the others, okay? And carbon and salmon is the example that I'll use. I'll talk about leverage points, the idea that there are specific places in the landscape where if you act, either positive or negatively, if you fail to act to mitigate some change, you're going to see a disproportionate amount of change in the whole region. Landscape planning, of course, with this fact that this landscape is a sea of national forest land. It is the communities are surrounded by national forests. The decisions that the Tongass makes, the way that the Tongass and the region plans and makes decisions about this landscape has significant impact on ecosystem services. And then this idea of landscape coupling. How are people and nature linked in this landscape, and what can we learn from that? So bundling, ecosystems are interconnected and complex. We know this, and the functions of ecosystems are very closely related. So the services that come from those functions may be bundled together, okay? And the bundles typically originate from a single ecosystem type or condition or a specific combination of types and conditions. And forests are a great example of bundles. We get a lot of different services from forests. If we liquidate if we manage the forest and we remove it, or we do land cover change, or if we do heavy management on the forest, we may sacrifice those other services forever or for a period of time for the priority that we've made for the timber provision service, okay? So there are also trade-offs built in here. And watersheds are convenient and common units for bundling and landscape assessment, but you could use counties, you could do a non-categorized approach where you developed everything into a very highly detailed raster, and we've tried some of that too. But the idea here is it's, in some cases, a lot more instructive to simplify the analysis and look at how things are related in watersheds. And this is one of the most interesting things that I've seen. Carbon sequestration and salmon productivity are very tightly bundled in this landscape. And this is based solely on the analysis of indicators and their relationship in space. Now, this isn't something that necessarily should be surprising, but it's meaningful. The fact that there's this correlation between the habitat, the capacity to produce salmon, and the mean carbon storage, and this is above ground storage. And this is a pretty strong correlation, the Spearman coefficient of 0.58. That's a pretty nice correlation amongst 946 watersheds in the Tongass, okay? And the idea there is if you're managing for salmon, you're gonna get carbon. If you're managing for carbon, you're gonna get salmon. And these two things are linked together, and they're arguably two of the most important services that this region has. Another way of looking at this is with a correspondence analysis, which involves a lot of complicated statistics to make something that's actually very easy to interpret. What you'll see is a series of X's and a series of squares. X's represent the different ranks for watersheds for carbon sequestration, and the squares represent for salmon productivity, and the ranks go from 0 to 4. And the proximity in space of these things tells you how closely they're related in this ordination space. The 4s are very close to the 4s, the 3s are very close to the 3s, and the 2s are very close to the 2s. So these higher provision areas of carbon and salmon are very closely related to each other across this landscape. And we, of course, look at which watersheds those are when we want to specifically manage them. Leverage points. Managers can't manage everywhere all the time and everything all the time. There's a need to be able to find the key places in the landscape. Am I out of time? Okay, sorry. I will wrap up very quickly then. The landscapes are heterogeneous, and so we need to find the places where the management actions have the most impact. And I am going to quickly show you where old-growth riparian forest has the most benefit flows. And we can generate tables, and we can identify watersheds where old-growth riparian forests and habitat regulation generate the best benefit flows for subsistence salmon. And we can do the same thing for estuaries and recreation, and we can follow our way through this analysis accordingly. We can look at how the LUDs of the Tongass forest relate to ecosystem services. And just very quickly, this is a similar diagram, and what it shows is that wilderness and development areas in these land use classifications are very high provision areas, whereas natural setting are relatively low. And whereas use, they're low use areas for wilderness, but high use areas for development. And I'm going to move past this because it's kind of complicated. But what I want to show you really quickly is if we look at the mean provision of services and the mean use of services, and we overlap these, we can identify watersheds where we have this very tight coupling. Now, this isn't the only place where the system is coupled, but they're particularly key spots. And they're very closely related, and I apologize for going over. I thought I had plenty of time. The main thing that I want to get across here is that we can look at these things from both sides, and we can use these to do a lot of different types of analysis in this system. And I want to thank you for being patient with me. And
we have time for one question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Does anyone have a quick question as we swap out the computers here?
Yes.
Thanks for that. I was really interested in your carbon and salmon overlays, and as we heard in the previous talk, there's this ratio between surplus and deficit in terms of how ecosystem services are evaluated and used. So do you envision at some point that you'll have more of a dynamic map or model, so you're accounting for inputs into the system and what's being taken out of the system in terms of carbon flux and associated impacts to salmon resources?
Yes. I mean, this is, what I've just shown you is a very simple analysis of the spatial patterns of these indicators and the relationships between them. Modeling the actual ecosystem processes and the relationships, I'm usually pretty loud, between them is as I think that was Dominic pointed out, are really, that is a, I don't want to say a separate effort, but that is a much more involved effort, and we have a lot of information to be able to do that kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, ultimately for decision support and for more in-depth modeling, that kind of thing would be necessary. Right. All set?
Thank you.
Thanks.
I've got the desktop locked. If someone could. Our next speaker is Dave Saah. It's a pleasure to introduce him, as it was Colin, because after working with these guys for years, it's so nice to have them back again to go over some of the old work that we've done together and also talk about the future work we'd like to do. There's been an awful lot of brainstorming throughout the early part of this week, and I expect that we'll have things sharpened up for a collective effort here by the end of the week, which is really quite exciting. Dave received his PhD in environmental science policy and management from Berkeley, and he is the principal for Spatial Informatics Group out of Pleasanton, California. It's a group of a number of different people with a lot of experience on ecosystem services from many, many universities and many different programs that have come from many different schools of thought. I really admire that because oftentimes different approaches to ecosystem services doesn't always lead to the most conducive way of working with things, but Dave has managed to pick up the best of all of them, I think. And also, I met Dave at the Tongass Futures Roundtable when he was talking about some of this work at the very beginning, and it's continued since then. In one of the first talks, we went through some of the different logistical challenges, and he's going to present some investigations of alternatives here.
I also sell ice, for those of you who are interested. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, so as Trista was saying, I first came up to Alaska, my very first time was care of the Nature Conservancy with Dave Gans, Dave Alpert, Keith Rush, and Norman Cohen. They asked me to come up and help them with a question concerning biomass utilization that's connected with one of their restoration projects. And what I'm going to show you today was the results of that effort. I'm pleased to announce that they just funded an additional effort to take this work and carry it forward to add or to fill a lot of the gaps that you're going to see today. So there's going to be some Swiss cheese here. And I'm expecting at the end of this thing, you guys have a lot of different comments that we can incorporate in the new study. So all of you guys know where we are. This is more for TV land folks over here. The study was located in the Prince of Wales Island, which is located in southeast Alaska. You know, there's several different issues, and again, this was a very new thing for me here. I'm from the Sierra Nevada, so our issues are similar but different. One thing that was very different was the intense harvest practices that you guys had over here. When I thought, you know, intense harvest practices, I've seen those before. I've seen some pretty nasty stuff, and I saw some of the photos that you guys had up here. Not that it's nasty, but it's a different management regime, different historical management regime that actually took me by surprise, to be honest with you. Another thing that was similar between where I typically do a lot of work and what I've seen up here was a rapid decline in the forest product industry. We've experienced it in California in the West pretty severely, but we have a lot of mechanisms to deal with it. It just seems like it hit this area more intensively than what we've seen. So, you know, so far it's, yes, similar, but more intense on both of these major issues. And another thing that was very welcoming to see with this whole thing was that there is an intention to move towards building structural diversity within these forests for a whole variety of different management objectives. things like improving forest health, building a more distributed age structure class within these systems, building in the effort to have resistance and resilience to potential climate change or water quality or habitat quality. And talking to people, both on this trip and the previous trip, there were some very nice integrated efforts for doing so. Colin presented some examples earlier today. Another thing that was very interesting, when I think about small community, I come from a tiny little town called Pleasanton, California. We consider ourselves minute. There's 70,000 people there. You know, we have our small town village. And when I hear about communities over here being a total size of 100 or 200 people, or I forgot, I was speaking to somebody yesterday, and they were saying, oh, that community is relatively large. There's 700 people in there. I was just thinking that, well, that's the grade school down the street. You know, that's a very different scale. You know, so the landscape is much larger, the populations are much smaller. But with that said, these communities were very dependent on the forest for their livelihoods, both directly and indirectly. And they're also dependent, which was kind of curious, on fuel oil for their heat. And what was nice about this whole conversation is that they were looking for alternatives for both, and how could they take the needs of both of those requirements for the stability of their communities, how can they integrate them together? And it got me thinking about energy security, since we are in Palin land here, and it seemed like that would be a buzz term. Not that there's a lot of folks in here that are of one persuasion or another. You know, another way of thinking about energy security is energy as an environmental service. And I am a landscape ecologist by training. I am not an economist, so guys on this table, please correct me if I'm misusing some words here. You know, when I think of you know, what's the current solution to thermal energy? Well, right now it's fuel oil. Right now it's extracted from Alaska, it's sent down to Washington, it's processed in Washington, it's sent back up to Alaska, and then it's distributed to these small communities. It doesn't seem very efficient. And the alternative to this, a potential alternative to this, is biomass, right? So the idea with the biomass is that, you know, in the Tongass, there is a lot of thinning, a lot of pre-commercial thinning. About from the numbers that I had from the last time I was up here, and I might have to update this, it was about 85 to 95% of the treatments that were actually implemented were pre-commercial. That's a lot of volume, right? We know that the forest restoration industry is spending millions of dollars a year trying to get this done. There's resources being put on the ground. This isn't a theoretical exercise or a thought piece. This is an actual action with resources being spent. Much of this material, when you look at the quantity and quality of it and the locations of it, could potentially be used for biomass heat. And depending on the technologies that you use when you actually translate it over, can be very efficient and can be potentially used as an offset. And so that kind of sets the stage for us. That sets the stage for where we want to go with things. And so the question that we were trying to ask with this whole project was, how does biomass compare to fuel oil in terms of a heating source? How much heat can we actually get out of it? Is there enough heat? Does it meet a demand? And what are the carbon consequences? And what we also added onto this things was the economic drivers, because as one of the elders spoke about earlier this morning, you know, she said that, hey, look, you know, our communities are under threat. The price of gas is $5.50 a gallon. That was the metrics of a threat. And so if you could show that same dollar value as a metrics as a potential solution, you could start, you know, trying to help with that conversation. Now, the problem that we have, again, since they are small communities and they are distributed, for any one of these communities to do these sorts of analysis is very costly. It doesn't make a lot of sense for a town of 700 people or 1,000 people or 300 people. The fuel stocks vary in terms of their ecology, their impacts, and their costs in terms of actually taking it to market. And the demands are going to vary depending on the community size itself and their needs and their special, unique situation. So you have a heterogeneous ecological system, and you have a heterogeneous demand society, human needs system that somehow need to work together, need to connect together, need to talk. And so our approach, notice how it's green and it's beautiful, is this clustered approach. How do we actually take both of these complex systems and marry them together to address this one service? And how do we do it in a way that actually quantifies all the variability that we're actually talking about? One way of doing it is clearly identifying the assumptions that we're using, be very transparent with the data sources that we're using, highlighting the similarities and differences between the different fuel sources that we're actually talking about, so we can get a real true paired comparison. And when you do these sorts of things, when you've ever worked on a carbon project or a return on investment or a scenario analysis, you'll learn about a concept called a baseline. What is our current business as usual? You want to measure your alternative against it, and then you subtract the two from each other, and you can look at the net benefit or the net liability associated with that action. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do it for heat, carbon, and another one that's missing here is we do it for dollars and cents. And so for the baseline, again, going back to that tanker network, we're going to look at the costs associated, and we stopped it. We assumed that oil was going to go down to Washington no matter what, regardless if we were going to actually use it for fuel oil here or not. So in our life cycle work, we picked it up from Washington coming back up. So oil got on these long-haul transport systems. They came over to a harbor up here somewhere. They got put into a distribution network that went into consumption. And so what we did for each one of these steps is we measured those values. We measured the amount of heat that was expended, the dollar values for most of it, and the carbon consequences for all of it. And the consumption, right, the demand, dictated how many tankers you needed to come up, because we don't need to bring up 1 million of them. There's a finite amount that's dictated by the demand of that community. Now, for the alternative, what we did is we have multiple pathways here. So the first one we're going to talk about is a terrestrial pathway. Again, so we start in the forest. From the forest, you have some sort of forest transportation. There's some sort of recovery component. You have your skidders, you have your loggers, you have some sort of mechanism to extract it out from the forest and put it into a landing system. You deliver it from the landing over to your facility where you're going to actually produce a biomass pellet or a chip or some sort of unit. In this case, we're doing pellets. That goes into another distribution system where you actually send it out to the actual communities themselves, which goes into consumption. Now that consumption, well, I'll get to that in a second. I missed my slide. The second pathway is the marine environment, right? So you go from the forest to a barge. From that barge, you go to a harbor. From that harbor, you go to the delivery transport system, and then you carry along down the same basic pathway. And then the third pathway that we actually looked at was a hybrid system where you went from the forest to a transportation system to a barge to the harbor, and then you follow it down the line. This looks like a BART line or a train line. Just follow the colors and you'll see where they actually go. Oh, 5 minutes, holy smokes, I got a lot to go through. And so what you end up having is and then this whole thing gets determined by the consumption values, right? And so that was a very simple map. The reality is that it's very complicated, and so you end up looking at the community. So you can see the spatial distribution of the communities. They all show up here in red, and you can look at the brown dots. That's where the lumber transport facilities are for your barges, and then the black ones are the actual harbor units. You link those, and what we have over here is the demands for each of the different communities. So you can see each community has a different demand structure associated with it. The components need to get linked together, so we actually have a network that actually shows both the marine environment and the terrestrial environment. How do these different elements actually link together, right? So you're moving the stuff on something. This is what you're moving it on. And this is the available biomass. This was actually produced through a lot of the work from TNC and others, and they produced an actual volume at specific locations that get linked into the network that go along those same basic pathways. And so when you think about it, you have different segments that you could actually quantify. You can go from the forest to the yard to the community, and what you're trying to do is you're going to connect every one of those locations through each one of those transportation systems to each of those communities based off of the demands, right? And so you could guess that there's a lot of complexity associated with this, and you're making a lot of different assumptions. You're making assumptions associated with your fuel efficiencies. You're making assumptions associated with the emissions associated with each one of these different steps, and you want to track them all. But when you make those assumptions, you don't want your analysis to be solely fixed on the price of 1 gallon of gas, what it is today. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to figure out what the average price was, what a high cost is, and what a low cost is. Same thing is true for your efficiencies. You also don't want to make you're not using the brand new truck with a high fuel efficiency all the time. You're not using a brand new converter at that processing plant to produce the most efficient form of pellets. So we have a high component and a low component, low efficiencies. And we modeled out every combination of each of these guys. And we, again, back calculated it to the demand of those individual communities. And what we came up with is we came up with some pretty interesting results. We came up with, again, the colors here, and I kind of glossed over a couple little steps, but just look at the main color types. So the brown ones are the terrestrial pathways. If we got everything off the terrestrial pathways, that's what you would see in brown. The blues are if we got everything just off the marine, and then the gray is if we just got everything off the hybrid. And what this graph is showing is the net carbon savings compared to fossil fuels. And so what it was showing us is that you have somewhere between a 70 to 80% savings in carbon compared to fossil fuels, fuel oil. Main reason for this is that the biomass is close, the fossil fuel is far and dirty, right? And so there's some massive benefits that you could realize right off the bat. When you look at the heat implications over here, same sort of thing, just look at the major color types. And you know, the reason why you have, there's three little bars is that they were deciding where should you put the actual production facility. So we're trying to compare the production facility sites themselves. And as you see, it doesn't really matter. You have massive savings on all of them. This is the net difference in heat. You know, the biomass, you expended more heat using this biomass alternative compared to the fossil fuel type. Okay, and the last one, which was pretty interesting, was the dollar savings. How much did you actually save in terms of dollars? How much would that end user actually benefit from this? Because you know, if it's going to cost them a lot, they're not going to go for it, or a select few might go for it. And what we found was that there was a dollar per square foot per year savings across the board for the location for each of these biomass facilities, no matter which processing plant you actually used. And we accounted for all that variability within all the basic assumptions. This was a really surprising finding. And so there's a whole bunch of caveats, but the first thing I wanted to say is this is amazing. I mean, we've done studies in the southeast and the northeast and all over the lower 48. I've never seen anything like this so quickly. Typically what you see is you see a debt period over some period of time, and then you get a benefit over the long haul. It seems like in this scenario, with this specific construct, with the geography, the politics, and all those sort of things, everything seems to be in the right place at the right time. There's a big but, and since it's on TV, I had to put a different one. There's the conversion cost, the willingness to pay. We didn't take that into consideration. Are people really willing to convert from fuel oil to pellets? There might be some sort of philosophical reason why they don't want to do that, or they might not want to bear the upfront cost of buying maybe a pellet stove. We didn't take into consideration the social license or the coordination. We didn't look at that. The in-forest processes were unaccounted for. So what does that mean is that this study picked up things from the landing. This week we've been talking quite a bit in terms of how do we actually pull in those in-forest processes into this conversation. I personally think that there's going to be a benefit from it, and I'm almost done. The labor and capital availability, we're assuming that there's a labor pool that's willing to do this, and that there's money that's available to actually get this thing implemented. That might be a barrier to entry for this whole thing. And the estimates that we use for those assumptions, we tried to use as the most conservative estimates we could think of because we didn't want to overshoot anything. And that's why you saw the error bar so small. If we put in more realistic volatility that we see in the market, the distributions would change a little bit, but I think it would only show more benefit overall. That's all I have. Thank you for your time.
Does anyone have a question while we're bringing Steve Colt up?
I do. Yeah, I'm curious on the transition technologies for biomass. One of the major things for any type of biomass is moisture management, and small diameter logs for pre-commercial thinning typically have a very high hog fuel content, which is not viable for a pellet industry, specifically Southeast Alaska. A lot of our pellets that we have now are imported from BC as a byproduct, being turned into a co-product and shipped up here right now. As pre-commercial thinning, as that's a viable option, what are the transition technologies that are available for small communities to be able to implement this, in theory, high hog fuel, high ash content, low-grade pellet potential, which the heating BTUs per pellet with high hog fuel isn't as high as what most people get out of BC. I'm wondering what transition technologies you've looked at to be able to implement for these small communities.
So as Trista was talking about beforehand, it's our group has we have quite a few folks in our group, and I would have to bring in one of them to answer that question. I'm a landscape ecologist, but we'd bring in one of the biomass technologists to actually show you. There's a variety of different current solutions that could be brought to bear. Especially, I mean, you brought up two separate issues that confound each other. There's the ash content and the moisture content, and there are some current solutions that we could apply. This stuff, when did we complete this study? In 2008, 2009? I know there's, we're doing the similar sort of study up in the Northern Sierras right now, and I just saw some new numbers come out, which might be interesting for you to look at. So if you can give me your name and contact, I'll get back to you on it.
Yes, real quick.
I've actually been involved in doing exactly the same analysis, and I think your numbers are way low, but we can talk about that later. I think the savings is much, much higher than your
That's great.
But the other technology that we're actually doing analysis, I was just retained by a capital group in Atlanta to do it. First of all, there's no problem getting capital for this project at all. I can guarantee you that. But purification, to get rid of the moisture aspects, have you looked at that technology at all, and what the savings would be with that?
I did not for this study. I haven't, but we have in other studies. And that's, I mean, so again, when we're updating this study, it's these new technologies that we're going to try to bring into this conversation.
Because that solves an awful lot of problems in Southeast Alaska that you have with pellets that you don't have other places.
Right. Oh, that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, Steve Colt with the Institute for Social and Economic Research, fellow economist and someone that's also been a colleague of mine at a number of ecological economics conferences. He's had a number of very active studies here in the region, some particularly interesting ones locally on tourism and recreation and fisheries in the local area. When he's going to talk about ecosystem service values, and just calling back to the first presentation, when we talk about values, it's really important to think about what you're going to use those values for. Oftentimes people get really excited about the value of ecosystem services, but it's kind of like if you've got a big dollar sign, it's almost as if you are getting excited about selling Band-Aids to a hemophiliac. So if it's not necessarily the indicator of success that you might be looking for. So Steve's going to talk about some of the limitations and some of the qualifications of how you use values and why.
Thanks, Trista. It's that time when people's heads are starting to droop, so if you want to stand up, stretch while I talk, feel free. And the Alaska Airlines pilots always say they're going to make up a few minutes. I'm going to see if I can make up a few minutes too. My story is very simple. It's a cautionary tale. It's a caveat emptor on the use of dollar values. And the next thing I have to do is figure out which button to push. Just down arrow? Side arrow. Other down arrow. The other down arrow. Okay, so here's the outline. Here's the quiz. What Southeast Alaska tourism sub-industry generated $16 million in revenue from one activity in one small place, relatively small place, one location in 2006? You can come up with your own answers, but the answer we came up with in our field research is helicopter-based dog mushing on the Juneau ice field. Probably not a low carbon footprint activity, but nonetheless quite interesting numbers when you think about economic change in the Southeast region. Okay, we've been steeped in the context of my talk I'm focused on tourism in specific, but first I'm going to talk about a general effort to understand or to find really dollar values for the full array of ecosystem services, but we're going to come back to tourism. I'm interested in tourism in Southeast because it's, I think, one of the very effective ways to monetize the value of ecosystem services, and for better or for worse, monetizing a service is a very good way to assure its can be a very good way to assure its protection. So first I want to talk about an exercise that I participated in California and for the California coastal ecosystem. This was organized and paid for by the California Ocean Protection Council, which has a mission to, wow, this screen is small, Trista. Maintain healthy, resilient, and productive ocean and coastal ecosystems. So it's broadly familiar to what we're all trying to do here. And this commission was formed in 2004 with the California Ocean Protections Act, one of on Governor Schwarzenegger's watch. They contacted the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, and I put that up there just to indicate the sort of gravitas that, to me, seemed to be associated with this effort. And NCES, as it was known, assembled a team of about 20 people, and I was lucky enough to be one of those 20. But the important thing about this group and what they were trying to do is that the economists were in the minority, but so was everybody else. We had a minority of ecologists, a minority of GIS people. We had lawyers, policymakers, including people from the council and the Office of the Governor, OMB, at pretty high levels of policy making. What did they want us to do? They wanted essentially a menu or a scorecard of spatially explicit and policy relevant values for the ecosystem services that are generated in coastal regions of California. Over and over again, we heard one analog from the most senior policymaker who had previously been involved in energy, and he was convinced that by having a scorecard that showed the environmental benefits of solar photovoltaic and other solar technologies, they had been able to materially advance the deployment of solar technology in California. And so this method could be used for coastal ecosystem services. In essence, and a colleague of mine made this slide, they wanted to know answers to questions such as, how much is 1 acre of salt marsh worth? And they had concrete uses in mind for the numbers. They were thinking about mitigation, compensation requirements, offset schemes, and all the other tools that are in the toolkit of the regulators down there, where they have very complex human-environment interactions, typically at very small scales, the scale of a parking lot or a Walmart or something like that. So it took us only 4 days of meetings to agree on what our matrix framework was. And I say that tongue-in-cheek because I naively expected that this part would only take an hour. But it illustrated to me the challenge of bringing together people from different disciplines and truly taking the time to hash out a common vocabulary and a common way of even thinking about the problem. But we did it, and we ended up with an empty matrix. The rows going down the side are the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment ecosystem service categories that you've been seeing thrown up on the screen here this morning. And the columns are 10 to 15 distinct ecosystem types that the ecologist insisted were ecologically distinct and should be treated separately in our analysis. They had to be separate cells to be filled in. And what did we want to, then we went out and we searched the global economic valuation literature. We wanted to put numbers in every one of these cells, or at least that's what the ocean protection people in California wanted. So I invite you to take a little guess about how many cells we were able to find defensible, peer-reviewed numbers for dollar values per acre for ecosystem services. Here's what we found. The green is what they wanted, a range, meaning more than one study, ideally a narrow range. The yellow is where we found one number, meaning one study. And the blue-gray is where it says, see Note 7. And if you go to Note 7 or Note 6, it has a sort of apologetic discussion of what numbers are out there. It's apologetic because I wrote the notes, and I was one of the 3 economists, and I was genuinely embarrassed that our profession had not been able to do better, because after all, we've been in this business for almost 30 years, or more than 30 years. So a very empty matrix was the result, and in words, we delivered our unhappy, well, we delivered our results to policymakers. They were probably unhappy. Very few economics papers were doing spatially explicit work as of 2007. Hopefully that situation is improving rapidly. We also found that even when values were spatially explicit, they were for some unstated or mishmash or bundled group of services. And I will say that's not surprising or not unexpected, but nonetheless that was a significant finding, and it made it difficult to populate our table, which had specific ecosystems and specific services. And finally, where we did find values, ranges of values, they varied widely. But this is a summary of that we put in our published paper, which is in the Journal of Marine Policy, of hundreds of studies that we actually looked at fairly carefully. Only 35 had units that I could even identify. And of those 35, only 4 had units of geography and a flow of services, as Trista was talking about, as opposed to some number that might have represented a one-time payment or an asset value or something like that. And most of the data was in terms of people and households, sometimes households of undetermined size. It really got me thinking about how the economics profession has, if we haven't already done it, we've got to clean up our act on the specificity of what we do when we come up with these numbers. Just a couple of graphics to show the range. There's an interesting one. On the right is the range of, that's recreation. Recreation values, dollars per acre for beaches, something that economists have studied quite a lot and something that matters to people and to policymakers. But look at that range. From $8 to $346 per acre is what our literature is coming up with. Not terribly useful by itself to a policymaker. So that was the message in California, and just in case all of this was not obvious to us up here in Alaska, this study motivated, our work in California motivated me to go back and look at some numbers that we had come up with for dollar values for charter sport fishing in saltwater areas in the Tongass region. We had originally generated these values by mining the Alaska Fish and Game Charter Sport Fish logbook database in 2007, which at the time we thought was a new and exciting thing to do. And we were able to come up with, to make a long story short, we were able to come up with concrete numbers for a rock-solid indicator of value, which is actual business revenue collected by actual business people in Southeast Alaska. In other words, a marketed version of this service. And we were able to get these numbers by 6-digit statistical area. And that's what our little map here shows. We were able to map the intensity, but we mapped the intensity in clients per area. So I said last week, I said, whoops, giving away the story. I said, can we get let's get the area, the geographic extent of these statistical areas, and let's actually look at what the California people wanted, which was dollars per acre. I did it. It wasn't too hard. And this is the range, arranged by from lowest to highest of revenue per square kilometer. So we could run around quoting the average, and that would be the average for all fishing statistical areas in Southeast Alaska, $2,000 per acre. But, in fact, it varies from what look like a lot of zeros. There are no zeros in this graph, meaning every single one of these stat areas had people going, catching fish, and paying money. But it looks an awful lot like zero until you get into what we all know are the big fishing charter hotspots. And this is another way of plotting it, which only an economist could appreciate. And if you drill down into the data, the highest density or the most valuable on a per kilometer basis is right outside Ketchikan. Why? Because there's lots of people there and lots of people come on cruise ships and they can get them out fishing quickly. And the highest value for actually a slightly aggregated area is $50,000 of revenue per square kilometer. I have 2 so what slides and then I'm done. So what? Obviously, we confirmed what we all know to be obvious. But never hurts to repeat the obvious, especially when forest management is on the line, or fishing management for that matter. Huge variation in the measured values of ecosystem services per unit area. Something that the California people really didn't want to acknowledge, at least when they started our project. Secondly, I think the literature search confirms something that I've sort of known but never really wanted to confront. Economists tend to think this way about benefits to people, so we measure household willingness to pay. We don't talk much about the geography or the ecosystem services that the ecologists probably tend to think about. And this is a schism that has to be, still I think has to be bridged, better bridged, if we want to take valuation seriously. Lastly, just to come back to my overall theme, which is caveat emptor, I get to quote once again from my favorite critical paper about this whole business, which was by wildlife biologist Bob Whedon, one of the revered elders of wildlife biology by now in Alaska. This, in a 1987 speech to a bunch of wildlife types here in Juneau, perhaps here in this room, he said it best, and I'm just going to read it for those who can't read the screen. He advocated a cautious embrace of this valuation stuff. The economic view is or can be made to be a valid one. The problem is to keep it in perspective. Besides, if we, meaning people friendly to wildlife and ecosystem protection, if we do not choose to estimate the worth of wild things in economic terms, others, not so friendly to nature, will. And he put it even more succinctly in these 2 quotes. I do not advocate turning away from economic valuation, nor do I advocate embracing porcupines too warmly. Thank you very much.
Any immediate questions while we call up Marc? I really appreciated that, especially because so frequently we do get questions, speaking from the perspective of public agency, about what is the value of ecosystem services? Tell us more about that. And if you think about the complexity of talking about value, if you just think about even a house, you might assign values in so many different ways. If you wanted to liquidate everything in a great big garage sale, that would produce one value. If you wanted to have the house appraised so that you could put it on the market, that would reveal a very different value. If you wanted to estimate replacement cost, say for insurance purposes, to physically recreate everything, that would reveal another value, especially if you had to recreate, say, your grandmother's favorite china cabinet or something that had very high personal value that was hard to compensate for. So it illustrates that there's numbers of different ways of talking about value, but it also matters what kind of position you're in to either buy or sell, or the public is looking for those goods to be provided. Marc Conte is from the Natural Capital Project at Stanford University. Is that the right? Okay. And he earned his PhD at UC Santa Barbara, and he's an economist. It's a pleasure to have him here because there's so many different ecosystem service assessments efforts, and we've heard about so many of them. The Natural Capital Project is another one. And he's going to tell us about a project in one of his case studies we were talking about this the other night is from Fort Lewis. And I remembered that when I was at University of Washington, Gordon, Dee Boersma took our class out to Fort Lewis to do studies on the checker spot butterfly. This is from my former life as a field biologist. And it's a military reserve. And so it's very barren because they're launching grenades and stuff all over the place. But ironically, that's also causing a lot of disturbance that keeps the trees down. And so therefore, it still has prairie. So we piled out of the van, all of us with our butterfly nets. And there we are prancing through the prairie after these butterflies. And in the exact adjacent field, there were all the new recruits in full-on camouflage and face paint on their hands and knees crawling around after military maneuvers. It was a very odd juxtaposition, but I'm really excited to hear more about this example and the multiple different values you can use of different places of ecosystem services and the very different ways we need to think about different public and private agencies in providing them.
Which down arrow is the one that does it?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I have been to Alaska before, but out on the peninsula to Chignik doing some work on the salmon cooperative there. So this symposium's allowed me to tread both physically and intellectually new ground, and I'm really appreciating my time here. Yep, thanks. Sorry about that. So before I get to the Fort Lewis and the Joint Base Lewis-McChord example, I'm going to go through some what I think might be overly pedantic, but also I think important information about how economists think about ecosystem services and resource use. So I'll start just with a basic illustrative example of a private landowner making his or her own land use decision. Talk about voluntary public good provision, so I appreciate Trista bringing that up earlier. And then get into some what I think is important and policy relevant research about the provision of these environmental public goods and the collaboration opportunities that exist between public agencies and private organizations like the Nature Conservancy. And then I'll talk about Fort Lewis a little bit. So just a simple example here from the Olympic Peninsula in Washington is a stand of coastal Douglas fir trees. And if you add to that some people who are willing to go out and cut those trees down, as well as some capital and infrastructure, you can, as a private landowner, have this nice pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, which is the timber available for sale. So here I've described this as the private benefits of habitat conversion. We've gone from the standing trees to then the log timber. And thinking about the net benefits, what you do to the landscape when you remove the trees is, and here I'm imagining a clear cut, I know there are lots of different management practices obviously, but you're left with a landscape that now is denuded. And so the trade-off that exists for society, for the social welfare, is decide about what are you giving up from having the trees be standing to having the trees felled and available for use in construction and other purposes. And so if we think about that trade-off and these external costs or externalities, some of you may have heard that term before. On the top, you're going from the private landowner or manager's decision-making process. And on the bottom, what you're seeing, this is what you get, a simplistic representation of what you get from leaving the forest intact. So here we have a pictorial representation of several ecosystem services and environmental public goods, which I'll make some semantic distinctions here where biodiversity generally isn't thought of as an ecosystem service. And there's been a real shift in conservation, and I'll talk about this a little throughout, how the relationship between economics and conservation efforts has changed quite a bit from the passage of the Endangered Species Act that Peter Kariva mentioned earlier when it unanimously went through the Senate. And it was seen there as a much less restrictive or constraining act at the time because it came on the heels of the CITES Act, which is the trade of endangered species. So people in the act, the term was take. You were not allowed to take species. So you were thinking about maybe going out and killing a bear. And in the enforcement of the act, the Fish and Wildlife Service has seen taking as disturbing the habitat of the species. And there it's become a lot more contentious. And you saw in California, Representative Pumbo tried to repeal the Endangered Species Act. So that's what's led to some of this controversy. And in going from, initially economists didn't really appreciate the act because it was focused on biodiversity and all lands were subject to the same restrictions if the species was present, and it led to some perverse incentives. And now when thinking about the motivations for conservation, we're not just thinking about the northern spotted owl that lives in the old growth forest, but we're also thinking about recreation opportunities. This big picture with the group of people there is meant to represent the carbon sequestration and storage in the above ground biomass by these trees. And then also the downstream services provided by the forest in terms of water, filtration, and quantity that are important for consumptive uses and maybe even hydropower production, but also spawning habitat for Chinook salmon or steelhead that are in the Washington State area. So here's the distinction between the private trade-offs that exist and the social or the public trade-offs. And we don't really have to talk about this too much. I couldn't resist this given some of the comments by ecologists about economics in the past few days. Just wanted to make sure we were kind of thinking about things all in the same place. So just got a simple graph here of converted habitat on the x-axis. You can think about that as how much forest land is harvested for timber. And then we have some measure of value, and I haven't put dollars up there, and we can talk, hopefully we'll get into different ways of measuring dollars or measuring value and how the units don't necessarily affect the outcome. So when the private landowner from the first slide is making the decision about how much to harvest, they're trying to maximize the net private benefits, and that's going to be the difference between the total benefits and the private cost. And you see that on this picture, what that does is you get to this point, Q market. So that number of acres or hectares of forest is removed, right? It's logged. What we'd like them to do, though, is to be making this distinction, this decision based on the difference in the net social benefits or the total net benefits. And that would be doing a calculation between the difference between the total benefit curve and the total cost curve. And the difference between the total cost curve and the private cost curve are known as these external costs. And a lot of what's in there, in this context, where we're thinking about harvest of timber from a forest, are the foregone values of different ecosystem services provided by the forest. So what I'm going to talk about for a few minutes before going to the Fort Lewis example is thinking about ways we can achieve this provision or achieve more desirable land use and resource outcomes. I just basically said this slide, but I'll start off by saying one way to do that is by regulation. And earlier, I think it was Ken Lertzman brought up the idea that we need to get markets for ecosystem services, and once we get markets, things will be okay. And as an ecologist, it's stunning to hear the change that's happened from before. We needed to ignore economics. We wanted to conserve things because dollar value isn't going to capture, the markets aren't going to capture the value of these things to people. And now we're saying, let's just establish a market and everything will be okay. And of course, the truth lies somewhere in between. And my point is really going to be that in places where we've tried to just establish markets for these things in the absence of regulation, they haven't been so successful. And you can compare the outcomes of the Chicago Climate Exchange for voluntary carbon offsets with the outcomes of the European Union emissions trading scheme, which is backed by the constraints of the EU being a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol, as an example of how we need regulation in order to motivate the development of robust markets for these goods. And so, as Steve mentioned and Colin brought up, the value of the services that are provided by these habitats can be used to inform policy design. It helps us go from Q market to Q star. But also you can make that prioritization, as Colin showed in the maps, just by understanding the physical provision of those goods, which requires understanding of these ecological production functions, which of course vary spatially and can be quite complex. The other alternative for achieving these more efficient or desirable resource use outcomes is that we can have voluntary actions to contribute to the provision of these environmental public goods. And here you could think a simple example is just you are making a decision to contribute some money to the Juneau chapter of the Nature Conservancy, knowing that they will engage in some habitat restoration or conservation outcomes. So I'm going to skip the definition of the public good slide, thanks to Trista's work earlier. And so the question becomes, who will provide these public goods? So for individuals, in the absence of regulation, this voluntary provision, the choice is between you've earned some income from some employment opportunities, and you can either spend that income on private goods, so you can go buy some food, clothing, or housing, or you can contribute that money to an organization that will then provide the good. And let's stick with the Nature Conservancy as an example. So what happens is, because of the characteristics of public goods, when you spend your money on food, you benefit from that food consumption directly. When someone else spends their income on contributions to the Nature Conservancy, you benefit from that contribution. So you can have you have a major incentive to free ride, essentially, right? Instead of making a contribution that if everyone contributed equally, we'd have great public good provision and we'd have a nice equitable outcome. What we tend to see in markets, in the absence of regulation, is an under-provision of these goods, given this opportunity to free ride. So the government can account for this under-provision through different policies, including taxation, obviously. So what I'm going to turn to now is some examples about habitat conservation as a public good and the impacts of government provision of this habitat management, conservation, and restoration, and voluntary provision through land trusts and organizations like the Nature Conservancy. So, of course, we've seen from some of Colin's really nice maps that the provision of these services varies spatially. And so the location of conservation, restoration, and habitat management is really important in determining what quantity of services are enjoyed by the local populations. In some studies, we've seen that there's a different reaction to the provision of these conservation areas by federal and state agencies, by the local land trust, the private organizations who are essentially engaging in voluntary provision. And it's important to understand some of Gordon's comments earlier about adaptation and the adapt or die session yesterday afternoon. There might be an opportunity for these conservation organizations, if they're taking these agency actions fixed, to use those outcomes they're observing there to inform their conservation efforts. And I think it's an important opportunity for interplay that I'm not sure how much interaction there has been in the past, and it's still an open area for research. So I just wanted to show briefly on the Pacific coast, the states, Alaska, it's outstanding how many, what percentage of the area is owned by federal and state agencies. So it's almost 90%. And that decreases dramatically when you move to Washington, Oregon, and California. And of those lands, a lot of that percentage is actually, I would say, slated for conservation and habitat management purposes. We can discuss this, Trista will know better than I, about the U.S. Forest Service operating as a force of conservation, the National Park Service, and National Wildlife Refuges. So you've got a lot of area of land dedicated to conservation, which, and I think for these organizations, maybe their intention initially was conservation. But you also have a lot of land, and it doesn't stack up nearly as, it's not as significant as the other areas, but there are also some other agencies that are major landowners, such as military bases. And the Department of Defense manages about 1% of the land in the United States. And given the amount of habitat conversion that we've seen on privately owned lands, because of the fact that we have these external costs, there's a real opportunity to, and maybe a requirement for these major land managers to engage in socially constructive habitat restoration activities. So just a brief goal, their initial goal is really to think about military training and readiness, right? So they're thinking about why would they need to have the habitat, sustainable habitat on the land? It's because they need to have their troops trained under conditions that are relevant. So they want to keep the grasslands in Fort Lewis intact because that's very similar to habitat in some of our current areas of deployment like Afghanistan. But at the same time, they're also subject to the restrictions of the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act. So there is some regulatory binding mechanism that's providing motivation for them to engage in habitat conservation and restoration. So as I said before with the initial illustration about how private lands generally will under-provide ecosystem services, these installations, which were initially at the time of their establishment really in pretty remote regions, have now engaged or experienced a lot of base encroachment. We've seen suburban sprawl come, and we've got that abutting some of the boundary of Fort Lewis you'll see in a minute. And so the DoD needs a mechanism to ensure that they can continue their unrestricted use of the bases. And there's a program called the Army Compatible Use Buffer Program, which really is an allocation of funds for them to engage in the purchase of lands off base to prevent development. And initially, it was established just for them to ensure that the civilians wouldn't be too close to lodge complaints about the noise of firing the artillery or whatever. But these funds are also available for management of candidate species for ESA listings. So Joint Base Lewis-McChord is about 90,000 acres of forested and prairie lands near the head of the Puget Sound in Washington. And you can see most of the activities on the base are training in the prairie and the Douglas fir forests that make up most of the area on the base. But given the conversion of land that has happened on the off-base territories, this area has really become the habitat, the last refuge for several notable species. Here we've got Taylor's checker spot butterfly that Trista knows about from her time on the base, and several other species that inhabit both the prairie and then the forest, which is the western gray squirrel there. So why are they interested in this off-site conservation? There used to be about 150,000 acres of prairie in the area in the mid-19th century. That's down to about 20,000 acres today, and 2/3 of that is located on the Fort Lewis area. And you can see the gray here represents development, with the kind of lighter brown area representing open land. Not all of that is prairie. So Fort Lewis is engaged in these training activities, which doesn't mean the 2/3 of the prairie on their base are necessarily in good shape, but they do have funding available to provide restoration and conservation activities. So what they did is they engaged in a pretty, I think, an interesting collaborative effort with private organizations. At the time it was the Nature Conservancy, and now they're partnered with another organization because they don't have experience or expertise as the military in thinking about conservation priorities and land management off base. So they allowed the funding that they had available to transfer to local land trusts and the Nature Conservancy to prioritize areas off base for purchase, for conservation, and for restoration. So here are a lot of parcels in the county to the south where they've purchased prairie lands for the purpose of conserving one of the butterfly species of interest. And they've also engaged in a lot of restoration and reintroduction of candidate species. And that was a point I think it's important to make, that as these lands have become the last, well, not the last, but relatively undisturbed compared to private lands, there's been a lot of recreation opportunities for private individuals, and so we've seen kind of an inundation of invasive species, and it's increased the cost of managing these lands for the base. So I'm going to stop here because I've run over, but I just wanted to raise the potential for thinking about these goods as environmental public goods and recognizing that really emphasizing government's going to play a huge role in ensuring their efficient provision. Thanks very much.
So we've got another computer change. Anyone have a question while we're swapping things out? Or for any of the speakers?
Hello?
Yes.
I was wondering how many different ecosystems are represented in these military bases. You were talking about ecosystems that are close to ones found in areas of operation.
I'm not going to know the number of installations
There you go.
throughout the country, but they do represent areas. With this project I'm working on, the National Capital Project, our partner installations are the Pacific Northwest, so we've got my focus for there are also major bases that have engaged in this type of takeout work in Texas and southeast of Georgia. So we've got the Wild Pine, Red Pocket, Patterson. There's a number of bases face this type of last refuge for certain species in the spring. And they are being relatively proactive in doing. Gordon was just saying we did a DoD-sponsored workshop thinking about these issues recently. So
So,
nice opportunity to tap into the resources they have.
to repeat that for the sound system, you said there were a number of different projects in, did you say Texas?
Yep, Texas, Georgia,
Georgia,
Washington State, and we're also working in Virginia.
Washington State, Virginia, and Gordon Oriens is here saying that there's a workshop coming up. It was a year and a half ago. Sponsored by whom? Department of Defense in DC. Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Also to mention, Department of Defense has been a very active partner, as well as different arms of the military in partnering also with Forest Service efforts in greening its operations. A couple of notable examples here in Southeast Alaska have to do with using biomass utilization for co-heating projects, where it takes a lot of infrastructure to make some of these projects pay off, and there's a lot of very interested campuses in getting some conversion. So sometimes we're predisposed not to think about that, but I think that there's a lot of people taking a very different look at things. There's a Green Gov conference coming up in sometime this summer, and you can take a look if you're interested in other programs there. So our next speaker is Sarah Klain. She's from University of British Columbia. Pleasure to have her here. And in her past, she has done Peace Corps in Palau, which seems wonderful, and lots of great ecosystem services there. She's finished her master's at UBC, and she's pursuing her PhD there. So thanks.
So I'm in a very fortunate position and unfortunate position. I'm really fortunate to be here, and I'm so glad to have the opportunity. My advisor, Kai Chan, wasn't able to make it, so that opened up the opportunity for me to come here, and I'm really grateful for that. Also, I'm in the unfortunate position of standing between you and lunch, so I will try to move through my presentation at a clip. So to give you a flavor of the research that I did, I interviewed people in northern Vancouver Island, and I interviewed an environmental educator who told me, be it diving, be it whale watching, be it trying to figure out who a humpback whale is, it is reverence, awe, a feeling of insignificance bathing in the sense of how little we know and how small we humans are, how powerful and damaging we are as one species to the rest of it. Another older gentleman who I talked with told me about growing up largely on float homes in northern Vancouver Island. He said, we lived on the water, we worked on the water. A lot of our food came from the ocean. We had our crab traps out, we had our prawn traps out, and we did a little bit of fishing now and then. And you're always cognizant of the fact that the ocean provided you with your wealth, such as it was. But your food, your recreation, you were almost a marine animal. To go visit your friend or your neighbor, you had to get on your boat or your kayak and paddle there and linger over, and they lived the same as you did, and it was a wonderful life. So clearly, place matters to people. People attach really strong values to place and to home and to the environment around their homes and where they work and where they play. I was part also, like Steve Colt, of a National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis group, an NCES group of a wide variety of academics and practitioners who are concerned that ecosystem service valuation, putting a dollar value on nature, can oversimplify a lot of values. Human values, as you know, they're really complicated. What is important to people can be dynamic, it can change over time. Values can also be held on an individual or a group level, and depending on who holds it, and that will depend on appropriate ways of evaluating it. Some values, when it comes to natural resource management, they defy trade-offs. For instance, it might be against a worldview to do logging or mining in the headwaters of a place that is sacred based on your religion. There's also a lot of human values that simply must be negotiated before they can be traded off. Other values are experiential. There's the saying you just had to have been there to know why that experience was important. And some people have a lot of difficulty in articulating these kind of values. So for all of these reasons, with this NCES group, we developed a participatory GIS, Geographic Information System, semi-structured interview protocol. And me and my colleague, Rochelle Gould at Stanford University, we got to do these pilot studies. I did my work in northern Vancouver Island. Rochelle did her work regarding upland forest ecosystems in Hawaii. So this protocol can help catalog ecosystem services. It can help map and quantify some of these values. And both Rochelle and I found that it enabled people, locals, to articulate the social and cultural importance of nature. And we also really want to emphasize that it informs, but it certainly does not substitute from a participatory decision-making process. So, as many speakers who came before me said, there's great promise in ecosystem services. We think that through a broader accounting of benefits from nature, this can help result in better natural resource management. And if it's on the cover of The Economist, it must be true or partially true, putting a dollar value on nature. But the NCES group that I was part of, we were really interested in those values that simply cannot be appropriately quantified in dollar metrics or biophysical units. What do you do with these intangibles? So, as many people have said before, there's different categories of ecosystem services: provisioning, regulating, supporting, and a lot of the work that I've done focuses on cultural values. The purpose of my research was to identify and analyze residents' monetary values, non-monetary values, and do an assessment, a spatial assessment of threat intensity across the seascape. I designed my research in order to inform marine spatial planning, which is currently going on in the Pacific North Coast Integrated Management Area, or PENSEMA, just south of Alaska. My study site was the Regional District of Mount Waddington, BC, and I partnered with the NGO Living Ocean Society as well as the Regional District Government of Mount Waddington. So in my methods, I selected my sample, I did 30 interviews, and I tried to just get distribution across the regional district, and I interviewed people whose livelihoods are directly tied to marine resources. Many of these people are engaged in decision-making and resource management or involved in businesses associated with the ocean. I conducted semi-structured interviews, which began with a warm-up to develop rapport with the people who I was talking with, and then we got into the topic of what matters. We talked about their economic livelihoods, how they were connected to the ocean, and then place and heritage values, activities, subsistence activities, identity, spiritual values, artistic values, educational values, and intergenerational values linked to the ocean. And we also had spatial prompts. So I asked people to first identify the places that are important to your economic livelihood. So for a fisherman, where do you go fishing? Or somebody who does tours, where do you take your tour groups? And then I asked them, so in all these places that you've identified, can you assign 100 tokens distributed across the seascape to give me an idea of the relative importance of each location? Then I went into these prompts related to cultural ecosystem services to inspire their thinking about intangible ways and cultural and social ways that the ocean was important. And I asked them again to identify places on the maps that are important for non-monetary reasons and allocate 100 purple tokens. And then I asked them about perceptions of environmental threat to get their opinions of what are the areas threatened there. So this is some raw data from my research. And as you can see here, this area was one interviewee's perception of environmental threat. This is the Broughton Archipelago, which has a lot of net pen, salmon, aquaculture activities, and this interviewee thought that that posed quite an environmental threat. This was an area of non-monetary importance where he would go recreational fishing, and then he had some other areas where he would go for various reasons. So I took the spatial data from 30 different interviews and compiled them to make these compilation maps, which I think can be a good start of discussion about areas of relative importance. I also made a map of non-monetary value, and there's different values and different stories that connect to these places. A couple people mentioned the value of the Scott Islands, and that was where existence value came up. It only came up once, but one person thought these islands were really valuable, not because he's ever been there, but because he knows that it's great seabird nesting habitat. A lot of other people selected areas for non-monetary importance that were close to their home, which makes sense. People tend to value what they know, and they go and use their backyards more often than places further afield. I also mapped relative threat across the seascape, and again, this reflects the perception of threat associated with salmon aquaculture. So you can look at these maps next to each other and see that there is, I did some spatial statistics, there was significant overlap between monetary and non-monetary values and threat values. And there's different ways of mapping this information out as a way to spark discussion in a decision-making context. I also really want to highlight how when I asked people about non-monetary values, there was some resistance to these questions in my interview. So just over half of my interviewees, no problem. They identified the places, assigned the relative tokens. But I had 9 who, about over a quarter, who were not, they would identify the areas, but then they said, they're all equally important. I can't say that one area is more important than another for these intangible values. So they're just not, it's not okay to quantify intangible values for them. And then 5 of my interviewees would not identify places on the charts and would not allocate non-monetary value. And a lot of their refusals were quite interesting. So a couple people said the importance is not appropriately expressed as pegged to a specific place. For instance, one person said, I identify myself as a North Islander, and my identity is connected to the entire seascape, not just one particular location. There's also sensitive information about culturally important areas, and I, of course, did not probe for information that people would not provide willingly, often related to areas of spiritual importance or areas in creation myths. And this information, it's not appropriate to share that outside of the people that you're comfortable sharing it with. One of my interviewees, he wouldn't draw shapes on a map because he thought that that signaled that if he said this area was important, it meant that the areas outside of the boundaries that he identified were therefore unimportant and should be opened up for development. So he resisted any of that. And he also, several interviewees emphasized the point that particularly marine ecosystems are quite interconnected, and it's better to emphasize the whole rather than to isolate parts of it, as lots of people in marine spatial planning want to do to meet multiple objectives. Also, there's this idea that nature has gradients rather than hard boundaries, so it's a vast oversimplification to say this area is important and this area is not, when it's actually a gradient, not a hard boundary. I got some really interesting qualitative results. Some people really do think of ecosystem service provider, the ocean being an ecosystem service provider, providing jobs and livelihoods, a lot based on salmon in my study area. But there's other people who had ideas that differ dramatically from this idea of nature as service provider, and even had ideas that just aren't compatible with this idea of ecosystem service provider. One person told me about how she would go in her mind to the Broughton Archipelago, and she told me, she said, I feel like the tides are the lungs. It's on this slow breath all the time. The salmon are the bloodstream, and they're moving the nutrients around the body, and you don't want to interrupt those things. So she gave the ocean a body with a pulse and lungs. Another interviewee feminized the ocean. She said, I feel tears swelling up in my eyes, and I, in all my verbosity, don't know that I can explain it. I don't even think we have the language in many ways to explain our connection to nature, and certainly the connection to the ocean. Is it aesthetics? Is it emotional? I see it as, you know, I'm even afraid, because I have a science background, to use the jargon I use. I see it as being Mother Ocean, and Mother Ocean is life-giving. And echoing some words from the lecture at the beginning of today, I had other people who thought of nature as part of themselves. One fisherman told me, the ocean is important to me as my sense of identity. That is where I am from. Like the old saying goes, I have salt water in my blood. That's about the only way I can say it. One of the First Nation fisheries managers who I interviewed said, I've always been concerned about the fishing licenses for people. That's my love, is fisheries, always has been, because we grew up here. We are called the salmon people. It's in my blood, and it's just concern for people and the marine resources in our area. Also, echoing another talk that came right before mine, people bundled values and benefits around ecosystem services. One business owner who I talked with said, especially now that I have children, when you cook food that you've caught with your own hands and set it down in front of your own offspring, and it's good food, like a salmon that's so good for you, it's a spiritual act. That's like such a connection to place, to earth, doing something so tangible, getting and eating nutrients. You're out there just trawling that single line, and to be able to catch it, to do battle with it, sometimes you win, sometimes it wins. It's more like a dance than a battle. And I coded this for all sorts of different inextricably linked values. So there's other-oriented values, provisioning, subsistence, material, non-market values, outdoor recreation and activity, spiritual values, sense of place, artistic and aesthetic, and they're all bundled inextricably together in this person's mind. So in conclusion, this interview protocol did indeed enable value articulation. We had prompts that were specially tailored to the local place that were, in fact, emotionally resonant with the interviewees. Also, people do respond to maps, especially when it's maps of their backyard and their homes and places that they're intimately familiar with, and they have emotional connections and past experiences that they can relate to. We also got really rich responses to prompts about choices. For instance, I asked, how does catching your own fish, how is that different from buying one at a store? And we got really rich responses about the importance of nature in answering that question. So me and my colleagues, we think that this kind of tool, it's an excellent way to prime a deliberative decision-making process where people can discuss, negotiate, learn from each other in making decisions. So these maps, these metaphors, these bundles, stories, they really highlight the value and benefits that can be marginalized in planning. They convey a deep reliance on the environment and the extent of the connection to the ocean. And I also want to stress that not all important benefits and values can be expressed spatially or quantitatively, and they need to be expressed in other ways. So in conclusion, this protocol that we've developed, it engages local communities. And I think it can provide a better understanding of place-based cultural dimensions of ecosystem services. I think this tool and the mapping, it can inform and complement a decision-making process. There's a number of people that made this research possible. I want to especially thank my advisor, Kai Chan, and Terry Satterfield, as well as multiple partners in my research. and put in a shameless plug for some papers that are about to be published and have been published and are in the works. And please let me know if you'd like to learn more about this, and feel free to contact me afterward. Thank you.
We have just a tiny bit of time before lunch. Any questions for Sarah right now? Or any of the other panelists?
Thanks. I'd just like to comment on David Shaw's last slide where he had the caveats about the biomass. And I think one that should probably be added to that would be what other low-cost options are there out there. And here in Southeast, we very recently had Alaska Energy Authority do a draft Southeast Integrated Resource Plan, which looked at electric production, looking ahead a few decades for the region, as well as space heating. And they've got some tables in there regarding comparison of biomass to heat pumps. And the fact of it was actually obfuscated in the draft, but the contractor that did the report acknowledged to me when I questioned them about it that, in fact, the information there was wrong, and that for the many communities here in Southeast that have hydropower, the break-even point for biomass in terms of operating costs versus operating heat pumps would be a break-even point at 19 cents per kilowatt hour based on basically the price of pellets down south right now. And based on the price for pellets here in Juneau now, it's about 30 cents a kilowatt hour. So really, heat pumps are the low-cost option.
Great. So I didn't see you earlier, David. Great. Glad you heard that. And yeah, for any of you that aren't familiar with what heat pumps are, it's a new technology to me. It works like a refrigerator, effectively. It uses the natural chemical properties of refrigerant to translate heat from different sources to sink. So there's been a lot of exploration with that among communities relatively recently within the past few years. So yes, whenever you make a decision about costs and benefits, it's in within the context of the other alternatives available. And those are always changing. Other questions? It's been a very interesting session. I'm really, really proud of this panel. Gosh, folks, ecosystem service panels are very, very tough, and it can usually be a very mixed bunch, but man, these are really high quality presenters, and I'm really glad of the variety of information we got. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I really appreciated the discussions today. I did have a question about the typology, and Colin talked about this maybe with the ontology, and Trista, maybe you could address it with the work that you've done with the chutes, but just basing these ecosystem services on the MEA, and maybe how on the Tongass at a local scale, how we could address finding these ecosystem services that are unique to either local communities or across the whole of Tongass, or what you might propose for adapting it to the forest.
So the question is about moving from a more general description of what ecosystem services are to a more place-based, relevant approach to ecosystem services. Is that a summary? Well, I thought Sarah might have a point on this with respect to eliciting values and cultural perspectives from people and how that's done. Since the question was directed to Colin, I'm sure you might have a perspective on translation of different typologies, if you'd like to answer. Also, there's recently I published an article on ecosystem services in the Encyclopedia of Life Sciences, and it goes through a number of the most typical definitions of ecosystem services and why you might choose one definition over another. Some are very specific, some are very general. We mentioned that in the Deschutes study, which is a GTR, which also came out last year. So that's a reference for you. But Colin or Sarah, did you either?
You can go first.
Okay. I think in terms of making these things realistic on the ground, I really think that you do have to have a sense of place. You do need to think about where you're doing this. And at least in the context of a rapid look at your system, you need to think about what information you do have and how you can bring that to bear. And Steve talked about this as well, the transparency of that information and the transparency in the way that you use it. And so going from a very general description of services to a more specific operational kind of use of that, I think needs to really consider the sense of place. And not only in the way that Sarah really beautifully illustrated to us of the people that are receiving those benefits, but also going to the sense of place for the people that are making decisions or that are responsible for trying to manage those services and that have a strong influence on the people that are receiving the benefits. And of course, those groups aren't mutually exclusive. Managers often live in the places and they benefit from these things too. So thinking about the local context as well as the management context, what kind of information do we have? What kind of timeline do we have to make decisions? What kind of uncertainty can we work with? That's really important, and really that's where you have to take some pragmatic approach, I think, to, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's one way to kind of get more specific, I think.
I just have a few on-the-ground details to add to that. One thing is I didn't use the phrase ecosystem services at all when I did my interviews. I phrased it all around what's important to you in relation to the ocean. Tell me about what's important to you, because there's a lot of jargon in ecosystem services that aren't particularly resonant with a lot of people who aren't in the ecosystem services line of research. And then I did code them afterwards with my own typology, but I really left it open when I was doing the cataloging and talking to people part of it.
Great. And earlier she'd mentioned some approaches to deliberative valuation. Steve, you're sneaking away as if you don't have anything to say on this subject. And he confessed to getting all heated up, and he said you'd never get to lunch if he started talking. So if you're interested in this topic, he's apparently got an awful lot to say about this. Any other questions? Not at the moment, but I'm sure you will have a lot to discuss over lunch. I'm so pleased to have such a full room. Thank you all for coming. And a lot of thanks to the organizers and to the panelists. Thank you.
You guys, cycle back in after you get your food, please. We're going to have a lunchtime program as well. Thanks. Trista.